You were born in Birmingham or Bradford or Brighton, you're 8 years old, your accent is local, your football team, if you support one, is local, your school is just round the corner, you know how to queue, how to say sorry when someone bumps into you, how to sing jingle bells at the school concert and say happy birthday at the right speed. You dream in English. Now imagine that one day a letter arrives and because your parents' temporary refugee status has been reviewed and revoked, the state tells you must leave. Not to a homeland you remember, but to a country where you've never lived, whose language you don't speak, whose politics and prejudices you do not understand. That is a core obscenity here, not paperwork, not perverse incentives. The forced export of children from their home. Under Shabana Mahmood's plans, refugee status becomes a kind of rolling probation. Initial status is cut from 5 years to 30 months. It can be reviewed, but only if the Home Office decides your country is still unsafe. Settled status, which was previously available after 5 years, is pushed out to 20. At any review point, if officials decide that conditions have improved, the message is, "Thank you for coming, off you go." And crucially, the Home Office has now confirmed that children born here to refugee parents are expected to leave with them if that status is revoked, unless the child has managed to obtain British citizenship. And there's no birthright citizenship in the UK. Under the British Nationality Act, a child born here is not automatically British unless at least one parent is British or has settled status. Staying 10 years can create an entitlement, but Mahmood's 20-year settlement rule ensures that many families will be in permanent limbo long before the child hits that threshold. In other words, we are deliberately designing a system where children can be born here, educated here, utterly integrated here, and still be bundled onto a plane because their parents' temporary paperwork has expired. Lord Dubs, who arrived in Britain on the Kinder transport, has accused Mahmood of using children as a weapon to make the UK less attractive to refugees. He calls the policy shabby and says he is depressed by the Labour government adopting it. It's an extraordinary moment when a survivor of Nazi persecution has to explain to a Labour Home Secretary that you do not play chess with children's lives as a border control strategy. The justification from the Home Office is that we must remove perverse incentives, the idea that people might have children in order to block removal or send children on boats to create a legal anchor. But look at the logic. First, it takes a very cold imagination to assume parents risk their children's lives in the Channel simply to exploit the British legal system. The research consistently shows that people flee because of danger and desperation, not because they have memorized paragraph 4b of the immigration rules. Second, if you were convinced some people try to game the system, there's a basic moral line. You do not deter adults in Calais by threatening children in Croydon. You do not say to an 8-year-old, you must grow up as a deportation risk in order to send a message to smugglers. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is very clear. The best interests of the child must be the primary consideration in all actions concerning children, including immigration decisions. Refugee children are entitled to special protection, and family life is to be preserved, not weaponized. Best interests doesn't mean uprooting a child from school, extending family, friends, medical support and cultural familiarity and dumping them into a country they barely know or do not know at all because it looks tough in a headline. There's a particular cruelty here that is easy to miss in the noise about numbers and flows. Children born and raised in the UK are not merely physically located here, they are socially and psychologically formed here. Their identity is British in the thick, everyday sense. The jokes they understand, the curriculum they study, the slang they use, the sports day they remember, the doctor who knows their medical history. To deport such a child is not simply to move a body from A to B, it is to rip out their social roots. It is to say all that belonging was a kind of administrative illusion. You thought you were from Manchester. The Home Office has decided you're actually from Albania or Sudan or Syria, even if you have never walked the streets of Tirana or Khartoum or Aleppo. We know that child psychology, that forced displacement, especially when combined with the stigma and uncertainty, is associated with anxiety, depression, educational disruption, and long-term trust issues. A child who grows up knowing that at any review point the state might decide to eject the family is not integrating, they're living under a kind of permanent suspended sentence. And then there's the language question. You are told that your home country is somewhere whose language you do not speak or read. Overnight, the child goes from being fluent and confident to functionally illiterate. That is not an orderly returns process. It is a form of state-sponsored humiliation. What makes this worse is the openly political calculation swirling around it. Nigel Farage has welcomed Mahmoud's language as extremely encouraging, albeit with his usual doubt that it will be delivered in practice. Kemi Badenoch's criticism is not that the proposals are too harsh, but that they do not go far enough unless Britain leaves the European Convention on Human Rights altogether. And in the background, ministers are flying to Strasbourg to weaken the interpretation of Article 3, the protection from inhuman or degrading treatment, and Article 8, the respect for family life, so that mass deportations become easier. In other words, the pressure on Labour is not please be kinder, but please be harsher. The temptation in government is obvious. If Reform UK is hammering you on migration and the Conservatives are shouting about being soft, you reach for brute symbolism. You search for a dramatic break with the previous system. And what could be more dramatic than saying the era of permanent protection is over? But look at who is actually being asked to carry the burden of this political theatre, not the smugglers, not the traffickers, not the ministers who presided over years of backlog chaos. Children. Children are to live with 20 years of conditional status so that ministers can say at the next election, we've restored control. That is what some Labour MPs have called performative cruelty. It doesn't even work on its own stated terms. Denmark, whose model Mahmoud is copying, did indeed reduce asylum numbers after its crackdown. It also produced a generation of people living in limbo, marginalised and embittered, which is hardly a recipe for social cohesion. You do not build social cohesion by keeping large groups of people in a kind of civic purgatory, terrified that any improvement in their situation or their parents' homeland will trigger their expulsion from the place where they call home. Defenders of the policy fall back on legal technicalities. They say these children are not British in law unless their parents are settled. That is correct in the narrow sense. The UK has never had full birthright citizenship. They say we will not separate families. Children will go with their parents. That sounds humane until you realise it means exporting entire families, including British school children, to schools where the state itself recommends its children avoid travel. They say there will be safeguards for vulnerable children. Every child in this situation is vulnerable. Vulnerable to losing their education, vulnerable to losing their language, vulnerable to a lifetime of feeling that the country that raised them never really wanted them. At the same time, the government is actually actively trying to narrow the scope of the very human rights protections that might have given those children legal remedy by lobbying to restrict how the Strasbourg court interprets Article 3 and Article 8 in deportation cases. So, the message is, we will deport you. We will call it law and order. We will work to ensure that the courts are less able to protect you if the removal is in fact degrading, dangerous or destructive of family life. That is not the rule of law. That is the manipulation of law to shield the executive from the moral consequences of its decisions. It is perfectly legitimate to want an asylum system that is efficient, that discourages dangerous crossings, and that removes people safely when claims are clearly unfounded. But a humane system would start somewhere very different. It would treat children born and raised here as future citizens in practice and move the laws in that direction rather than weaponizing their precarious statement as a deterrent. It would prioritize fair, fast decisions so that families are not left in limbo for years, then blamed for putting down roots. It would expand genuinely safe and legal routes so that parents do not feel they have to choose between a dinghy and a dictatorship, and it would preserve, not hollow out, the human rights framework that exists precisely to stop states taking the easy, brutal option when they feel politically cornered. Above all, it would refuse to normalise the idea that a child can be treated as a kind of administrative extension of their parents' visa. Children are not visas. Children are not perverse incentives. Children are not pull factors. They are moral agents in the making with their own rights, their own achievements, their own attachments, their own futures. If you can stand at the dispatch box, look at a policy that contemplates expelling a child from the only country they understand into a language and culture they've never known, and call that restoring all law and order, then something has gone badly wrong in your moral compass. We once took pride in accepting children off the trains from Nazi Europe and giving them a home. If our politics has now descended to the point where a kinder transport survivor has to beg a Labour government not to use children as a weapon of deterrence, then the repugnant thing is not the presence of those children in our schools and playgrounds. The repugnant thing is us.